All right, and let me introduce our speaker today to everyone, even though Hillary Joy Virtanen is known to a lot of people in the Finnish American circles. So I'll still do the formal introduction. Hillary Joy Virtanen is assistant professor of Finnish and Nordic studies at Finlandia University, where she teaches in and directs the minor granting program. A native of Toivola, Michigan, Virtanen holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Scandinavian folklore. Her research interests include holidays and festivals, folk music, leftist folklore, and ethnic stereotypes. She is part of the editorial staff of the Journal of Finnish Studies and a member of the board of trustees of the Finlandia Foundation National. She lives at the parsonage of Grace Lutheran Church, a former Suomi Synod church in South Range, Michigan, with her family. And her talk today is about Finnish America and the folklore and the traditions in Finnish America. So welcome, Dr. Virtanen.
Great,
I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for coming. This is super exciting. This has been a month full of thinking about Finnish and Finnish American culture for me, and so I'm glad to get a chance to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give just what I hope to be a rather short lecture. People know I can talk until you tell me to stop or walk away, but I want to have this where it's kind of short, and then we can actually use what I say as a springboard for discussing the things that we think of as Finnish and Finnish American traditions. And so I'll just give us a little bit of a framework to do that, and then we can jump off. And there's pictures and stuff as well. So let me just share my screen here really quick. And then put it on the slideshow when this little button thing comes out of the way. There we go. Okay, so the first thing I'll say is that, when we have FinFests, like FinFests actually are a tradition that has been established within the Finnish American community since the early 80s, since 1983. And so when we have a FinFest together, it's a tradition actually that we have navigated and negotiated over time. And it becomes something that has expected sets of things that will happen. We know that there'll be like lectures. We know that there will be music and dancing. We know there'll be the tori, where you can go and pick up a bunch of great things to buy. And so this in itself, even though it's very new and very modern, is very much a Finnish American tradition. And so I'm happy that even though COVID has kept us all apart, we're able to maintain this tradition in some way and to continue to celebrate our Finnishness. So that's a good feat in itself. One of these times we'll be back together and we'll be like, hey, remember that time we had to have this online and we didn't get to be together? So cherish the fact that we can do this and that we have been doing it for a while. When I think about, I want to go ahead and talk about a couple different things, because a couple different words to define. Because when we talk about Finnish Americans and we talk about Finns and we talk about Americans, we're looking at these ideas of culture, ideas of ethnicity, and ideas of tradition. And so I want to just kind of break that down just a tiny bit. And so when I teach my students what the word culture entails and what it encompasses, I like to say that it's learned behavior and practices that develop through and largely serve to maintain social connections to others. So when I describe it to these students, I say that culture is what different humans use to respond to their common needs. And so a lot of us, when we were in grade school, we learned about the three basic needs we had, right? Food, shelter, and clothing. I would also say that we have this very important social set of needs as well, which includes things like friendship, family, love, competitiveness in sports, like what have you, right? So there's these kind of four basic needs that we really have. And culture is, human cultures across the world are how it is that we respond to these needs. And so when you think about it that way, you can think about very basic things and how it is that cultures can create these responses to them and why it is that they create these responses. And also how it is that these responses to our needs that we create as a group can change over time. And I'll show you some examples here in a few minutes. The idea of ethnicity, if you think of ethnicity as kind of like a subset of culture, the anthropologist Thomas Hilland Erickson gives this good definition when he says that ethnicity simply refers to aspects of relationships between groups which consider themselves and are regarded by others as being culturally distinctive. And so, I think that this concept isn't terribly unknown to Americans because a lot of us have these different backgrounds. Some of us have an indigenous ethnic background. Some of us have ethnic backgrounds from other places in the world. And so we can kind of consider that as a part of our own identity and recognize parts of it. So it includes things like practices that we share. It includes our language. It includes sometimes religious traditions. It includes food preparation traditions, holidays, and all kinds of things. And so, culture, again, is this kind of set of responses to our needs. And ethnicity is a part of the grouping of cultures to kind of make these things happen. So, people can belong to more than one ethnicity, as well, as a lot of us Americans know, right? And then, so the next phrase that I want to or the next word I want to just conceptualize before we go forth would be tradition. And so tradition is often conceived as these kind of age-old practices that can be frozen and just passed on from generation to generation. And so a lot of times when we think about traditional things, we just it's always been like that. It's always been there. If it disappeared from our life, it would be very strange, but it's seen as kind of frozen a lot of times. But it carries on through this constant process of renewal and reimagination. And it's through this process that cultures worldwide continue to survive and adapt to social change. So the folklorist Henry Glassy says that tradition is the creation of the future out of the past. And that's a pretty good kind of basic thing to think about, because it allows for tradition to be dynamic. It allows for us to think of tradition as things that we actually have effects on. But traditions give us this cultural framework out of which to meet our needs and to imbue meaning in much of what we do through engagement with and reshaping of practices that our ancestors and other predecessors have created. Traditions survive and adapt when they are beneficial to the group, and they die out and disappear when a group no longer needs them. New traditions develop over time as groups create new cultural practices. And this fact is really important to understanding Finnish American culture. It allows us to understand how, from this festival first celebrated in 1983, we're now taking part in a tradition that we constantly navigate and negotiate over time. So if we go back to that idea of needs and how a culture can respond to them, I've got these 4 pictures that demonstrate this. So up here, we've got a picture of some food. If anybody has had a korvapuusti lately, you know that they're excellent, little kind of sweet buns. I'm wearing a Finnish national costume from Lapua down in the lower part. Shelter, I'll explain that I do not believe that saunas are a shelter typically, but in a lot of Finnish American homes, the idea of not having a sauna is kind of, oh gosh, that's terrible. Like, what would we do with that? And so, this is a culturalized response to what are considered a broader part of shelter related needs. And then there's social needs. So up in the upper left-hand corner, we have members of Lauluaika from the Twin Cities performing at a Juhannus festival in Toivola, Michigan. So all of these needs are responded to through the cultural triggers that we have, right? And if we belong to different cultures, we might be eating different things. If, we were in France, this food might be, a chocolate bun or a brioche, something like that. Be wearing vastly different clothing, wearing kind of chic, fancy clothing. There would not be a sauna in the home or right next to the home at all. And the musical practices and festival practices would be quite different. So you can kind of overlay different examples from all kinds of different cultures and see that this is kind of a consistent idea that I'm trying to put here. So when we think about, these are pictures of us doing these things now. And I should also just kind of say that with regard to clothing traditions in Finnish America, a lot of times you'll see it in t-shirts like Paha Poika or FinFest 2013 or whatever. You've got these things that mark you as being Finnish. Sisu, very popular t-shirt. And so this is, when you put on like a kansallispuku, it's kind of this higher level. Like, I don't have one because I can't afford it, but it was fun to try on. And it represents Finnishness that people can all kind of see and understand on a Finnish and an American level. So when the early immigrants came back starting in the 1800s, they came over with these practices and these traditions that they had that when they got here and they went and settled in different places, they needed to adapt a little bit over time. And so you can see here on the left, we have these siblings. They were the Mackinnons who lived in Mass City in the early 1900s. And they're wearing folk dress that's very reminiscent of kansallispuku. It's not fully kind of solidified as a formal model of it, but they're dressing for a picture in a way that represents them as being Finnish immigrants. And the person who gave me this photo said that, this was meant to kind of represent them looking stylish and being able to kind of send it and be like, we're still Finns, we're in America. But this is their dress response. They were used to wearing certain clothes. And when they came over here, they kept those certain clothes. they had traditional festivals and stuff that they celebrated. So in Toivola, the Juhannus has been going on basically since people got there. It's only been canceled a few times, and one of those times was due to COVID. But if you look at different descriptions of the festival over the years, you can see that there's these very stable things that are done. And then every once in a while, they'll put new activities, different, music groups or different venues, different ways of serving food and stuff like that for the group. So this tradition comes over here and it sets itself on the American landscape. And then sometimes it can kind of stay stable depending on what's going on. And sometimes it has to change a little bit due to what is available, the resources, the social resources and actual physical resources of being able to enact being Finnishness. Up in the corner up here, we've got, these are my great grandparents, actually. You can see they were pretty successful hunting that year. And it looks like my great grandma Helmi was kind of a fiery lady. I don't know where I get that from. But, they have these foodways traditions that they brought over from Finland that in the Upper Peninsula, at least, it was pretty easy to just take the Finnish traditions and kind of keep rolling with them because similar landscape and stuff like that. And then at the bottom, we have the building tradition. So this is a picture of a barn at Hanka Homestead Farm also up in the Upper Peninsula. So when they come over here, again, they have these things that they do. Sometimes they're going to have to vastly change them. Like if these folks move to a place like a city, right, and they're from rural parts of Finland, they're going to immediately have to adapt to very, very dramatically to what it is that they can do and how it is that they can practice culture. But different Finnish American communities essentially over time inherit these kind of practices from their ancestors, and then they have to adapt them. Sometimes they keep these practices, sometimes they completely disappear. And the immigrants themselves, they're going to do things again, like creating transitional languages like Finglish, creating different forms of building things because certain resources weren't available. Certain types of wood might not be available in parts where Finns settled and such. Certain festivals weren't considered useful anymore. So, these things are all a part of this experience of being Finnish American and navigating a new culture for ourselves. Another aspect of Finnish American culture then is this idea of interethnicity. And so this is where people from different cultures, they come together, they come together in the workplace, they come together in their neighborhoods and in the schools, and they start over time to share the things that they do and to adapt different things from other people. And so one of the more famous examples I would say in Finnish America is, if any of you ever go on the different Finnish American Facebook groups, a lot of times people will be talking about pasty recipes and stuff. I love pasties. They're one of my favorite foods on earth. And, anytime somebody wants to ask me, hey, you want a pasty? The answer is always going to be yes, even if I just got done eating one or two. Always room for more. But one of the interesting things about pasties that some people realize and some people don't is that the pasty, as we understand it, actually comes from Cornwall, England. And it was brought over by fellow miners from Cornwall who went into places like the Upper Peninsula, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and met their neighbors, the Finns, and, hey, you've got this food pocket we're eating for lunch that's very convenient and very tasty. So, Finnish Americans have adapted the pasty in their own way with slightly different ingredients and stuff like that, such that Finnish Americans a lot of times consider pasties to be a Finnish ethnic tradition. And that's totally fine. It's a kind of interethnic thing that has happened, people having access to other things. One of the interesting interethnic developments that established itself up in the Upper Peninsula is actually a sauna beer being brewed by the Bosch Brewing Company in Hancock, Michigan. And so you can see that, a corporation, it's not a terribly large corporation, but a corporate entity sees that, hey, we could actually market something called sauna beer. Like I can't imagine, Budweiser coming out with something like this. Like this is something a local brewery did in response to local perceived needs of food practices, right? So it's an interesting thing. I should also mention, I didn't get a picture of it because I could only find grainy pictures and didn't have time to run to the store yesterday, but there is actually also sauna makkara, which is sold by a local sausage company, Woolworths. So again, a company with a German last name has this interaction with the local Finnish immigrant population and says, we could actually market to this. Like we can be a part of a foodways that they have. So the interethnic connections are big. Another area that you see it in, of course, is the Finglish language. And so when Finns come over here and they're speaking exclusively Finnish, over time, they start kind of adapting in English words, English phrasing, and still using different conventions of Finnish constructions and such to create this really interesting transitional language that looks nothing like Finnish sometimes, and also nothing like English. So these are all kind of this aspect of interethnicity. It's where you basically take things. You borrow from each other, you try out different ways of doing things that match with your own culture and kind of make it acceptable to your own group. And this is also something that happens in a lot of groups worldwide. And then there's these very stable traditions that came over here. And even though they can be endangered if young people aren't practicing them and if there isn't another generation to take them on, a lot of times people will see the practices that people do and think, this looks very much like what you see in Finland. And so on the left, we have Pekka Olsen. A couple of years ago, I went out and interviewed him with Michael Oykaren for this film. And Pekka is a woodworker. And a lot of the things that he does are different types of woodworking that you see in Finland that are very traditional. And he's actually gotten to study with master carvers in Finland and such. And so he took us out into the woods and showed us how he kind of listens to the forest and pays attention to what's going on in the forest before selecting the types of woods right there that he can use for his craft. And so this is very kind of stable. It's very traditional. It's got very old kind of roots. And it's something that he learned from the people before him and that he's now showing us how to do. And at the same time, showing apprentices he had. In the middle, we've got the Juhannus bonfire in Toivola. A lot of times, it's almost kind of like a tourist attraction, I would say, for Finnish nationals to come to our Juhannus because I guess it's very Finnish, and it, again, has this kind of stability. Like people just expect that it'll always be there. And sometimes it can be endangered. It was endangered by COVID, of course. Sometimes it could be endangered by rainstorms. And other times, the idea that maybe young people aren't going to come together and build the Kokko in the future and aren't going to come together and do the institutional things that need to be done to make it happen is a threat. But as a tradition right now, it stays very stable. It's something that's very recognizable. It's something that has really, really clear ties to the previous ways that it's been celebrated in Toivola. And it's something that everybody considers, this hallmark of community practice. And on the right, we have Lori Oykaren, who's a ragrug weaver and also a ragrug crocheter, I guess is the word for that. And so we went and visited her one time and she showed us her loom and her weavings and stuff. And so this too is something that is considered very Finnish American. Weaving is still, among some people, a very popular tradition in Finland. And in Finland, they even have next to lakes, these special areas where you can wash your rag rugs, like these kind of cool docks with certain places to put them up and stuff. And so this is a tradition that has come over here and has been able to maintain kind of a sense of stability. There's a really, really wonderful book about ragrug weaving by the folklorist Yvonne Lockwood that tells a lot about this and shows, Lori's one of the people featured in it. But so essentially, we have these stable traditions again that are very, very recognizable from the things that were brought over directly from Finland, from the ancestors. So, and then the next kind of category we have are the things that that show this kind of shift from being Finnish to being Finnish American in nature. And so on the left, we have Pekka Olsen with me, and we went to his house. I've visited with Pekka so much that, I've got hours and hours of conversations with him, but we went to visit him one winter because it was burbot fishing season and some burbot had been caught. And we brought some caught ones over to his house. Burbot is this fish that it's called mare in Finnish. And they're very distinctive because they spawn in January, which, is a very, very weird time of year for that. And so you catch them under ice, and then their roe is extremely good and their flesh is delicious. It's very mild. Even the liver is mild. So if you ever get to try it, I suggest it. But we went over to Pekka's house with some freshly caught mare, and he had agreed to make a kalakuka for us. So kalakuka, of course, is this Finnish traditional delicacy from the province of Savo. It typically has this rye crust and, onions and fish and potatoes, I think. But Pekka made his slightly differently because of the resources he had and also the taste that he liked. And so he explained as he made these pies that when he was younger, they would use whatever flour they had around. And so, if they had some wheat flour, if they had some rye flour, they would throw it in, whatever. Because he was surprised, we were all surprised at how early the fish came in that year. And so the only thing he had on hand to make a crust at that moment was pie crust, like you can buy in the store, but he made it. It was delicious. It was wonderful. So he takes this tradition that he's grown up with and this traditional word that he's grown up with and adjusts it to the things that he has available at the time and the needs that we all had to get that pie made in order to make a film, right? So in the middle picture, we have Joseph Kyllönen displaying a personalized St. Urho license plate from the 1980s. And so St. Urho and St. Urho's Day, of course, are very, very much just Finnish American. So this is one of those traditions that we have now that only was established in 1956 that we can look at and say that is not something from Finland. And it doesn't actually directly reflect anything about Finland. And so sometimes, people will look at that and be like, well, that's fake and that's, it's silly. It's why are they doing that? It's because we have a different experience here in the United States. And because we need to create things sometimes that may seem fake and silly in order to keep our culture going in ways that are acceptable just to us. And so, of course, people typically know that St. Urho's Day is celebrated the day before St. Patrick's Day in a nod to the Iron Range, Minnesota Irish people who were teasing the Finns for not having their own fun, cool things to celebrate. Ours is so fun and cool. It takes place the day before yours. And he was a really great guy. So, of course, for those who don't know, St. Urho, they invented this kind of story where he chased the giant, kind of like dog-sized grasshoppers out of Finland in order to protect the legendary Finnish grape crop, which, I mean, if you're a wine connoisseur, all the best wines come from Finland. Like you think Finland, you think wine. So, they just kind of create this fun thing. They have things associated with it, like wearing the colors purple and green. And there's this festival culture that's developed where there's parades, people have dances, people have whatever it is that community wants for that. So the St. Urho tradition actually is really great because it's something that was created on Finnish Americans' own terms. And it's something that we have say over and that we can do without feeling like we're violating or changing something from Finland and that we're being too untraditional to Finland. We're being traditional to Finnish America, which is who we are now, right? And then on the right, we have another invented tradition is the Heikinpäivä Festival here in Hancock, Michigan. And so we have John and Pauline Kiltonen who have just been crowned the Hancocky Heikki honorees. And so like a lot of American festivals, there's this kind of time where people will honor somebody. Sometimes there'll be a crowning, right? Like if you have your county fair, there's the county fair queen. If you have, different things like that, you always want to kind of honor somebody in some way. And so at the Heikinpäivä Festival, it's no different. And it's done under this very interesting Finnish American terms where, the festival itself was established to celebrate the idea of these kind of midwinter proverbs that continue to exist among Finnish Americans in this local region up here. And it expanded into this kind of, gosh, winter could be pretty brutal up here in the Upper Peninsula. We need something just fun to do right now, right here, that can get us through this midwinter blues stretch. And that references very distant things about Finnish culture, farming proverbs that people don't really say anymore in the everyday. The legends of this Finnish, patron Saint Henrik, who died in the 1100s and who isn't really celebrated in Finland anymore. He was a Catholic priest, right? Finland is now Lutheran. And it also ties to just the things that we here in America do on our own. So things like having a Hancocky Heikki, the Heikki of Hancock, that's not from Finland, that's from here. So we've got this kind of cultural tradition that sort of expands as people need. So again, there's this kind of reconfiguration of traditions to reflect available things and the needs right then. There's this creation of entirely Finnish American traditions that don't reflect Finland at all. And then this creation of entirely Finnish American tradition that has faint nods to Finland. So these are all kind of, hopefully as you're listening to this, you're all thinking of things like, oh, I can think of examples of that because that's what you can use to discuss. And then the last thing that I'll mention is this idea of Finnish reconnections. And so even though there's this core group of immigrants that we know comes between about 1880 and 1920, and then it really kind of fizzles out after that, there are still Finns today who moved to the United States. I'm looking at one right now on my screen, right? And so there's continued direct contact with Finland through newer Finnish immigrants. There's also, the internet, right? Like we have ways that we can connect with each other that people didn't have back in 1920. There's genealogy and DNA, right? Like tons of people are getting their DNA tested and then they're actually connecting with people across the pond and making that connection and then maybe visiting with them at some point. So travel, the internet, commerce, and continued immigration to the United States in smaller numbers make sure that we continue to have these kind of bursts of Finnish culture and ideas of Finnishness coming into America and kind of relivening things. So one of the ways that you can see this is through, again, international commerce. A tiny example of international commerce would be this. I have a picture of the tori from Heikinpäivä here in Hancock a couple years ago. And so they always have a market where you can buy things that are either kind of Northwoods themed or Finnish in nature. And if you look closely, you can see a couple of splashes of like marimekko fabric looking down on this picture of the tori. There's also foods available there that are Finnish, like laksloda, which I love. And then on the right-hand side, we see Pasi Somero, Oren Tikkanen, and Vai Viitala. They're at a jam session at the Juhannus. And so Pasi Somero was this Finn who came over here. He still is a Finn, he's still around. But he came over here as an intern and he got so enamored of the Finnish American culture that he could see. He actually wrote about it for his master's thesis. And he went to Juhannus and jammed with Oren, and they practiced these kind of old traditional Finnish American songs. And so people from Finland will actually come over here to see the culture that we have and to kind of interact with it, because it is an older thing. It is something that doesn't fully survive in Finland. So again, these are just kind of the points of ideas that I want to have so that we can talk about these things. So really quick, I'll just walk through the slides again. So this idea of cultural needs being met, early immigrant culture bringing us the raw materials that we have for creating Finnishness, but then being adjusted with things like inter-ethnic borrowings and people borrowing ideas from us. Stable traditions that are maintained from the immigrants and can sometimes adjust here and there to different American needs and American conventions of things, but remain very recognizable to Finnish eyes today. And then the shift of practices from being very, very recognizably fully Finnish to being somewhere in between, to being completely Finnish American. And then reconnecting with Finland over time. So as long as we continue to have dialogues across the ponds, as long as people have different types of Finnishness that they share with one another, we'll always have these different new traditions and these different kind of realignment of traditions going on in Finnish American culture. So that is all I have for that. And so I'll just kind of answer, or I'll ask, why do we keep and recreate the traditions that we do? And I'll go ahead and maybe stop screen sharing and we can start to talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Virtanen. This was fascinating. And now if the audience, if you have any questions here, you can go to the chat here at the bottom of your screen and just type your message there at the chat screen. I am just, fascinated. This is wonderful. Of course, I've known a lot of these Finnish American traditions, and just getting this information in just one package today is just fascinating. So we have Lisa Lambert pointing out that her grandfather came from Finland and had always been a dowser, and so he kept on doing it. And this is what we remember of our grandparents and the traditions they brought. So Keijo is sending greetings from the sauna. And
he's got a laptop with Sisu.
Yes. We have a question. Can you comment about religious traditions?
Yeah, I could, right? And so one of just like all practices that we have, Finns came over with the traditions that they had, and then they had to kind of overlay them on the American landscape. And so, a lot of people in Finland, they have a state church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. And then there were also the Laestadian movements that are primarily in kind of like the north and west of Finland. And, Laestadianism within Finland has a direct relationship, from what I understand, with the mainstream, the state church. But when people came over here, one of the interesting things, of course, is that in America, we have full religious freedom, and that you could, if you want to found a church, you just can. And so this allowed for different religious expressions to have freedom to develop and to change here in the United States. And so, with regards to the state Finnish church, the interesting thing that kind of happens over time is first they founded something called the Suomi Synod. And Finlandia University, or Suomi College, where I work, is, it was considered like the seminary for that for quite a while. And so the Suomi Synod exists until 1962, and it maintains this very kind of direct relationship, or kind of direct correlation, I would say, to the Finnish state church. And I mean, I guess there are people, probably maybe like Jonathan Runman, if he's around, he could comment better on this. But when the church, after 1962, when it becomes the Suomi Conference, they join the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is kind of a bunch of the Nordic Lutheran churches banding together because they realize that they have to in order to survive. And so this causes a shift, right? So does the shift in language. So there was a time when you would do the sermons and the hymns all in Finnish. And over time that changes as the immigrant population changes and as the nature of how you're going to be religious. So I don't know if that kind of helps answer the question, but yeah, anytime that you come to America with these different things, I would say that there probably are aspects of the church here, the ELCA church here, that, in a mainstream or a mostly Finnish congregation is quite different from some of the things that they would do in Finland, and also with the Lestadians as well. So.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to address this one question about future FinFests and these virtual events. If you go to the FinFest page, FinFest USA page, you will find recordings of the past events, and you will find the list of the forthcoming events. Next month, it's going to be a music event by Liz Jaakola. And then on May, it's going to be Tuomas Hovi from University of Turku Migration Institute there, and he will be talking about the Kalevala. Okay, more questions. So Judith has a comment. My mother made a soup dish called mojakka, yet my Finnish cousins didn't know what that was.
Okay, so I have an answer for that. So mojakka is
I know you will.
Mojakka is this, this very kind of popular Finnish American word for stews. So you could have like a kalamojakka, for instance, a fish stew, or you could have sometimes it'll just be like a beef stew. And so it's interesting because that word is extremely known among Finnish Americans, but not so much in Finland. I have a friend who a couple of years ago discovered this old book, or not really an old book, but this kind of document about Finnish regional dialects. And as it turns out, the word mojakka does come from an area in Ostrobothnia in kind of Western Finland, which coincidentally is also where a lot of the immigrants came from. And so it appears that mojakka was just this dialect word that was used in a very narrow area, but for whatever reason, it really caught fire and caught on here in the United States. So, there's Finland before the language really standardized, and actually Helena can kind of probably describe this better. There were a lot of dialects, before things like mass communication, television, radio. So you could have like these very narrow types of words that only existed in small areas, and then other places would have different words for it. But yeah, so that's the mystery of mojakka.
That's great. Thank you for a good question, Judith. And Dan is writing, Sisu aside, is there a recognizable personality trait that can be traced to Finland? It would be interesting to see how it might be Americanized.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think that can fall into us like thinking about the Finnish people. I'm thinking, I think quietness is kind of a stereotype of Finns, right? Like we can all kind of put personality traits into these kind of culturalized ideas of how to behave, right? Like we learn from each other, and so that's how you get personality traits in the first place. I guess apart from that, like I can't really think of anything off the top of my head, just because people are really so different. Do you have any thoughts, Helena?
I was just thinking that it would be a really interesting thing to ask people. Write just one adjective about how you would describe.
I wonder if we could do a poll. Like that would actually be pretty cool.
Yes, that would be cool. Can you do it from your end?
I might be able to. So yeah, if I can do a poll, I will set one up and people can throw a word in there and we'll see what we get. But actually, I don't see a poll option here, so they might not have it for the webinar.
All right, it may not be, but that would be something we could think about for the future. Just a discussion about what is Finnish. My adjective would be stubborn. Would that work for anybody else? So it's interesting that old folk music has taken root in the US, but maybe less than stable back in Finland. Did I understand that correctly? This is Mary asking.
So I would say that actually folk music in Finland is very well off. If you ever get to meet people who go to the Sibelius Academy, for instance, they have an entire department just dedicated to folk music. There's the Kaustinen Folk Festival in Western Finland. And so and then there's folk bands that actually are very kind of modern and very popular. And so I would say that it's not necessarily that it's kind of not as stable in Finland, but that it changes in Finland in different ways from how the music changes here. Because in Finland, they have this kind of broader understanding, I would say, of what folk music can be, based on just the ways that folk music and art music interact, and the ways that people don't really treat them as being separate things. But we have this kind of, I would say sometimes almost like a fixed repertoire. Like a lot of times with Finnish America, you can hear songs and know exactly where they come from. You've heard different kind of like schottisches or polkas and stuff like that. But in Finland, I guess, and people can debate this. There will be a whole lecture about it later in this series, I'm sure. But you can kind of see that we have these things that came from our ancestors, right? Like we brought these songs over and they're very kind of important to us. And then just in the years immediately after that, but we haven't had the developments in folk music that they've had in Finland. And so we approach it very differently. And we also have been a part of an American culture that has its own folk music that we also engage with.
Great. And if you are interested in this, we have that every other Saturday, not every other Saturday, every other month on the last Saturday, we have the music series going on. So Liz Jaakola is the next one. I think I mentioned that earlier. Yeah. So keep repeating so that people continue to participate. This is fascinating. We have over 200 participants.
Oh boy, you guys are making me nervous. Hopefully they're all cousins. I noticed that we skipped over Ramona's question, so I just wanted to ask that.
We did, yes. You see it there, so you can address that. So
do our traditions follow from any particular parts of Finland? Yeah, a lot of them do. One example I can give that's solid is, it's really interesting, but nowadays the midsummer bonfire in Toivola is this giant koko. It's this kind of big construction, sort of like tent shaped of wood that you set on fire. But there's different forms of kokos that exist in Finland. And one of them comes from by the Karelian Isthmus. It was traditionally found over there. And it's basically this tall structure where you take poles, like really tall poles, and kind of put them up. And then you stack logs sort of to kind of create this tall and very narrow pyramid. It sort of looks like the that famous skyscraper in San Francisco, I would say, is kind of the shape of it. And then you burn it that way. So it's called a saarikokko is the name of it. And, it could be like 20 or 30 feet tall, but it's very narrow the way it works. So, it must fall over dramatically. It must have these different things. In Toivola back in the 1940s, somebody built a saarikokko one year, and it also sort of resembled like an Ålandic midsummer pole, but it had tires involved in it. So they were burning tires, it was kind of something people did in the 1940s. So that comes from Eastern Finland. So you can see that somebody in Toivola had those roots. And I know some of the people from the community did come from that area. So that's just one example. But of course, the example of mojakka, this word coming from Ostrobothnia. There's different other word traditions that come, for instance, from the Finnish-Swedish border. So yeah, there's definitely regionalism that you can see in Finnish American traditions.
Okay, Paulette is asking to have a recap of, do we know who actually came up with the Saint Urho idea? Can that be traced back? You mentioned the 1950s. But
yeah, so there's two origin stories. And actually, if you get a chance, the Finnish American Cultural Activities in Minneapolis did a discussion about Saint Urho, maybe like a week and a half ago or so, and that's on their YouTube channel. So you could definitely hear straight from Minnesotans themselves. But essentially, there was a man named Richard Matson who worked at a department store in Virginia, Minnesota, and there was a man named Sulo Havumäki who worked at Bemidji State in Bemidji, Minnesota. And they each kind of came up with this idea at the same time. So, not being there and not having kind of a dog in the fight, I'm not really sure who is considered more legit, but essentially Richard Matson put forth that Saint Urho chased frogs out of Finland to protect the grapes. And Sulo Havumäki said that they were grasshoppers that did the same thing. So the world may never know, maybe it's hidden in an archive somewhere in a little letter or whatever, but it is an interesting thing because I think having multiple origin stories makes it catch on.
That's great. Yes, typical of folklore that how did this originate? And this is not that long ago, but we still don't necessarily know the exact answer to this very specific question. Elizabeth is asking, do people really say laxlåda for the salmon casserole?
Yeah. And sometimes you'll see it spelled Lakslooda, like using Finnish, phonetics, at least here in Hancock. So yeah, I've heard it like that. Like, I guess you could say something like lohilaatikko or something like that. But yeah, I've always heard it as laxlåda. And so there's, especially around that border between Finland and Sweden, there's this language known as meänkieli, our language. And so it's a dialect that is very much constructed. It's got Finnish construction, but it's got Swedish influence. And so I've taught community Finnish classes here in Hancock. And every once in a while, I'll actually find a Swedish word that's been Finnicized and brought over, by people's ancestors. And so one example I can give is that we had a unit on food and on, utensils and stuff. And so the word for fork in Finnish came up, and a student kind of got this very crestfallen look on her face, and she said, "But my grandfather always said it was gaffeli," and that comes from the Swedish word gaffel, And so I kind of said, "No, your grandfather was right. Like that's okay to have a dialect word that's based off of Swedish. That's actually super cool." So there is that mixing, and I mean they're very different language families. So it's kind of funny to think that you could take Swedish stuff from an Indo-European language and mash it up with Finno-Ugric, but you can.
And a lot of the Finnish immigrants, actually most, came from Ostrobothnia, where they were close to the Swedish-speaking areas. And in the Ostrobothnian dialects, you have plenty of borrowing from Swedish for that particular reason. Like, my mother came from Ostrobothnia from a totally monolingual Finnish home, but she always said hantuuki, which is the kitchen towel. So those kinds of words where, languages get affected by close by languages. Mm-hmm. So Helja is saying, thank you for reminding us about the fact that there are still many kinds of Finnishness that exist depending on where we are from and how our roots are affecting us daily. And that is so very true. Fern Malila is writing, there are frequent discussions on social media sites regarding differing traditions between Finland and the US. In some cases, people have very strong opinions on whether some of these things that have been adapted are real or really Finnish. How would you respond?
Well, the first thing I would say is that if they're being done, then they're real because they're happening, right? So that's one thing. But then the second thing is that Finns and Americans have 120 years between us from the earliest immigrants, right? Or like 140 years even. And so we are very, very different people from each other in many ways. And so the things that we do to create a culture and to respond to the surroundings around us and our needs are going to end up being very different from Finland. And so there are wrong ways to do things, right? Like there are some things that you do culturally that could be considered quite wrong. Maybe putting salmiakki in a kalamoyaka would be considered terrible, but essentially, if we're doing it and it's not actually like harmful and it's something that meets our needs, it's not the Finnishness that should matter. It's the kind of satisfaction in the fact that we're continuing on in a way. And, if I create something and I think this is me being Finnish American, the way that you find out if it's me being Finnish American is if other Finnish Americans take it on, right? Like, or if it's something that can take part in the broader culture. And so something like St. Urho, he really takes off because he responded to the needs that Finnish Americans had at that point for this kind of like social connection and this social identity that was divorced from being fully Finnish. So, it's real if it happened, and it might not be really Finnish some ways, but I don't think that really matters as long as it helps us meet our needs and continue community.
Great. Vanessa is writing, my Finnish great-grandparents went from Finland to Michigan to Colorado to California as miners. Are there any good books on the migration on Finnish miners? Let me, before you address this, we will be posting on the FinFest USA site a resources link, which might include things that participants are interested in reading more about. And I can't think of, there is a book about miners. I forget the name. Do you remember?
Well, let me look at my shelf behind me. Yeah, there are a number of good books. Finnish American history has really been blessed by having people in both Finland and America to record it and to document it and write about it. And so, there's general history books like Finns in the United States, which just came out in 2014. So it's, more recent. But then there's older works like, let's see. Oh goodness, where's the one? I'm trying to think here because.
Finlandia Foundation National published a book which has miners on the title, Miners.
Yeah, Black Ties and Miners' Boots is the institutional history of the Finlandia Foundation itself. So it's not about miners. But yeah, we'll actually, I guess we should just address that question by showing the list, because there are a lot of books, and I can put in some specific minor related materials in my list before I hand it over to Helena.
So look for the resources link on the FinFest USA page. Jonathan is writing, Finland was just ranked the happiest country in the world for the 4th time in a row. What are your thoughts about this? And do you think this extends to Finnish Americans?
So I have a friend in Finland who was thinking about doing a film about this, one of the first times that Finland received this accolade. I would say that it doesn't necessarily extend to Finnish Americans, because when they have this index, they're looking at like the society as a whole and the different kind of parts of that social infrastructure that would help to create happiness. And so Finland and America are very different places with very different social infrastructures, you know, and if you look at the things that contribute to this happiness index, things like, you know, healthcare, things like people having kind of a better work-life balance than we might have in the United States typically, those kind of things expand to it. So I don't think anybody's done a real study on happiness among Finnish Americans, but it would actually be comparing kind of apples and oranges in a sense.
Jonathan is commenting, there continue to be Finnish hymns in the ongoing hymnals published by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the remnant of the Suomi Synod movement. That's a good comment. Thanks.
Yeah, and actually, I should say that, yeah, that there are people who are still singing them. Jonathan, thank you for coming. Exciting. But yeah, there's instances too where you'll have Finnish language hymn singing happen in the United States. So it is still a living tradition. It's one of those things, you know, again, there's ebbs and flows of it, and there's different ways. Some people do it, some people don't.
Kristin is asking about blueberry foraging or foraging in general as a Finnish American cultural practice. How about other foraging? And she says her grandparents were Finnish from Kauhava, and they always wanted to go out and pick blueberries, mosquitoes and all.
I would say, yeah, foraging is a very important practice that I would say definitely is continued in the areas where it's feasible. You know, living in the Upper Peninsula like I do, I'm descended from people who did forage, right? And it's a very important part of my thing. Because of the pandemic, I became very addicted to foraging for mushrooms last year. And I've learned about a lot of different mushroom species and haven't died eating them yet. So, you know, I would say foraging is definitely an important cultural practice that people did, and that does exist among people in the regions where it's still feasible today. And so a lot of my friends in the upper Midwest, like that's what we talk about is, oh, we got the blueberries started, or oh, first strawberries. So I would say it's definitely important.
And the next question is about Finnish halls. My mother remembers, Kevin is writing, my mother remembers her parents going to dances in Finn halls near Spencer, New York. Were Finn halls common to other communities as well? She said there was a one-man band who played accordion and 2 other instruments. And this I know there is a book about Finn halls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Finn halls were extremely important to Finnish cultural continuation from the earliest days. And they were all across, you know, anytime you had a reasonable amount of Finns and they wanted to create a hall, they would do it. You know, and some of course had political orientations. Some of the halls were dedicated to more like the temperance movement. There were halls that were built for the knights and ladies of Kalevala. And so there were plenty of ways to create social groupings within the Finnish communities across the country, and plenty of things to do in those halls. And so dancing, I think, is a very important part of that legacy, the music and dance. And, you know, I mean, there's a band called Finn Hall from Minneapolis that very much enacts that tradition.
Hewlett is commenting, there are the traditional folk dances like Skottis, Sottisi, and Raatikkoon, and so on. We all have heard Raatikkoon at FinFests. If you've been to FinFests, it has kind of like been embraced by Finnish Americans, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Kim is writing, after visiting my ancestral home in Siikainen, I learned a lot about how Swedish culture influenced the Finnish culture in that region, which we were kind of talking about in terms of the food items and everyday words. Since the Swedes ruled Finland for so long and basically did not allow Finns to submit documents in their native language, and surely Finnish cultural traditions were discouraged. Do you see any blended Swedish-Finnish cultures? in American as part of American Finnish culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, that previous example of the language that, came over, that's a clear one. The use of a word like laksvoda to describe something that you could describe using Finnish. I know people in Finnish America who have, like I have a cousin who, his grandmother spoke Swedish, like she was Finnish and she spoke Swedish. And so these kind of traditions could live side by side in Finland and America. When we say that Finnish cultural traditions were discouraged, I mean, Finnish people were at the minimum 80%, or Finnish speakers were at the minimum 80% of the population. And so even though they weren't the rulers of the country, before the 1900s, basically, they had free reign to practice some of their things. I would say the religious traditions were the parts that kind of got suppressed. And that was a lot earlier on, it was during 1500s and before. And, also the witch trials up into 1700s.
Mm-hmm. Are there any, this is Jean, are there any particular traditions from the Northwest?
Oh, go ahead.
Is that the Northwest? Well, you go ahead.
Yeah, I'm assuming that they mean the Pacific Northwest. There's some really great Finnish communities in the Pacific Northwest, if that's what you're talking about. And so, we have Finns around like Seattle. We have Finns in like Astoria, Oregon and stuff. And so, yeah, I would say that each area has their own kind of traditions and their own sort of practices. And so when you have them being kind of transplanting into these new places, some are moving to New York City, some are moving to Lake Astoria, some are moving to the UP, that culture that they're going to practice is really, really going to relate to the jobs that they do, to the new landscape they live in. And so, I haven't really studied the Northwestern traditions just because that's not where I'm from. But having visited, I'm always kind of struck by the sort of fishermen's population that developed among Finnish Americans, for instance. And so that would create a whole body of folklore on their own. Logging was a big deal. And so, occupational folklore would have been a different.
CM Daniel is asking you to comment on the Finnish language and its sustainability, as it is so lovely and unique. It is true, it's lovely and unique. So how are we maintaining it here?
It's a safe language in Finland, so I'll just leave that part. But, in the United States, it is something that requires kind of institutional support, I would say. It's difficult to maintain a language if it's not spoken in the home and if it's not something that is regular. I can speak Finnish. I'm not fully fluent in it, but not having been in Finland in quite a while because of the pandemic, my Finnish switch really has to be turned on, like that motor has to be primed. There's things like Suomikoulu, which are kind of weekend day schools for kids. There's the Salalampi camp in Minnesota. So there are institutional supports for it. And there's also universities across the country that teach Finnish to college age students and sometimes auditors. And so, there are institutional supports for it, but it's difficult if you can't keep it as like a home language to really strengthen it and keep it going.
I would like to add to that because I've done some work on the maintenance of Finnish here in the US. It's possible to pass the language to the second generation, but the third generation becomes really a problem. I'm just writing a paper about my grandson who was a fluent speaker of Finnish until he went to pre-kindergarten, and then the switch to English. How he understands Finnish still, but says only isolated words. So that's pretty much what we have found, that by the third generation, the immigrant languages, they tend to disappear. Kara is asking, do you know how the Finnish Americans adopted the pasty? That was the cultural connection with the Celts, right?
Yeah. So yeah, basically, the people working in the mines together, they saw their Cornish neighbor eating something that looked interesting and smelled good and said, hey, what's that? So it's just like how Americans started eating pizza or Chinese food or.
And in a way, as Kara is saying, my family says it had something to do with the good food for the copper mines. It's probably easy to transport as a lunch for.
There's a stereotype that they would carry the warm ones inside their clothes, and it would kind of keep them warm because mines are cold. They're like 42 degrees down there. And then, it would also, your body would keep it warm at the same time, and then you would have something, hopefully body heat for lunch.
Barb is asking, it seems that a lot of the Finnish American traditions were started by the second generation. Do you think that new traditions will be developed by later generations?
I believe so. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of interest among younger people in their Finnish heritage. And a lot of times, we as elders, we kind of want to project what we want them to do, please continue this tradition, but they have to do it on their own. And so it'll be interesting to see the things that younger people do with Finnish American culture, because it is theirs, like it is all of ours. And there might be some things that don't work for them that we do now. And there might be things that they can develop or even adapt from Finland that'll work for them in the future.
Louis is pointing out, my mother made a 9-grain bread that was very dense, and I have not found a recipe for that.
Yeah.
9, that sounds wonderful. Judith, what about all the many religious factions among Finnish Americans and political factions? Are there anything specifically Finnish in this tradition?
I would say with regard to that, Finnish people can be pretty action oriented. Maybe that's like a personality trait, right? And so I always kind of have joked that 2 Finns is an organization, 3 is a schism. Because, one of the things that Finnish people did in the United States was they did band together based on religious, political, different social issues, which is how halls and churches were created. And, this very much reflected a kind of Finnish American perspective in everyday life. So yeah, definitely when you have the freedom to do that and you have kind of, hey, we're Finns, we think this thing, we're going to go ahead and band together and do this thing. It was a very common practice among Finnish American communities.
Julie is asking, is there a difference between Finnish joulutorttu and the UP version?
I find in Finland, the crusts tend to be flakier.
Yes, okay. Helja is writing, for those of us Finns, Finnish American, who live in pockets where there are no other Finns around, Finnishness is still a thing for us, although not recognized necessarily in Finnish American stereotypes. So that's very true.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy is writing, egg coffee is associated with Nordic foods in America. Is this something that is or has been consumed in Finland? Not while I lived there, but...
Yeah, I've heard of it, but nobody's offered it to me in Finland.
So interesting cultural thing, maybe very narrow. Mm-hmm. It has to be launched, maybe it can be sold, like the sauna beer and the saunamakkara. Egg coffee. I don't know if there's a market for it.
Yeah, well, it clarifies it. So like if you break it up and it makes a really nice clarified cup of coffee, but I'm always scared of having eggs in my coffee. I don't know.
David is writing, as a hobby winemaker, I was astounded to hear your reference to the Finnish wine tradition. Is there a story behind the development of wine in Finland?
So I must admit that I was being rather facetious about that. One of the reasons that the St. Urho story develops and kind of is funny is because it was people saying, oh, we have these great wines. So there is not a real wine industry per se in Finland. I was on Åland a couple of years ago and I did see a couple of vineyards. So there is some wine production, but it's not a very good area for it. So I'm sorry, I'm a pretty good liar.
We have some Finnish traits by Helja: creativity and innovation, hardworking, suggested by Janet. Back to Lauren's question, who are some famous Finns? Now there is a book in Finnish, the 100 most famous Finns. So
right. Well, she actually revised her question, so it's more about Finnish American.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Well, one of the ones that people always mention is Matt Damon, right? He's like an 8th Finnish American. Jessica Lange, also very famous Finnish American. There's Taina Elg, who was a superstar in the 50s. Gosh, who else is there? There's lots of kind of famous Finnish Americans, I would say.
There is a webpage, a Wikipedia page. If you just Google famous Finnish Americans, there is a list.
Mm-hmm.
Wikipedia.
Oh, difference between Nisu and Pula.
Yes.
Yeah. So Nisu, that's a pretty typical word for Pula in Finnish America, which is this cardamom flavored bread. And so it's kind of one of those words that came over here and we kept, but Pula is the word that's more commonly used in Finland today. And it's related to the Swedish word pulla. I was actually watching a movie on Amazon Prime a couple of weeks ago, because a lot of times that is one of the words that people point out is we don't say that in Finland, but some people do. So I was watching this movie called Heavy Trip, which is about this heavy metal band up in like Taivalkoski. And he asks this girl out and he says, do you want to go out for coffee? And she goes, yeah, and Nisu too. So, and she actually used the term Nisu. So some little pockets in Finland still use it. And it's a word that actually relates to like wheat or grain, I think.
Yes. Carl is asking, when did bilingualism fade away in the Finnish American communities? I think that the consensus among linguists is that it pretty much all the immigrant communities, that it fades away by the third generation, unless you do something really radical, like send those third generation Finnish Americans to Finland all the time, and where they are in a more monolingual situation. There used to be publishing houses in Michigan, Massachusetts that printed Finnish language newspapers. You're thinking about Raivaaja, I think, and I think I'll let you address that, but it's a small population. That's the problem.
Yeah, I agree. So it really is like the third generation, at least here in the Upper Peninsula, where it does kind of die out. Because there was more intermarriage, because people were kind of feeling like, you know, we need to move over to English. A lot of immigrants of different cultures were told that your kids aren't going to succeed in America if they're not, you know, English speakers, and if they're not doing that. And they were also kind of told that just kind of weird things like if your kid is learning a bunch of Finnish, they're not going to have room in their heads for English. That's simply not true. Like, kids are great at learning languages. And so youth is really the most important time to do that. So yeah, it's that kind of third generation, it seems, where it passes out. But in other cases, I mean, if you're not surrounded by their Finns and you don't have that local kind of institutional support for having Finnish being spoken, it could pass off a lot sooner.
We are starting to run out of time, or we have actually run out of time already. So we have some more questions here. If you, Hillary, if you would like to address some of them. And a lot of these are responses for other people's comments. We have some more Finnish traits like grit, and so on. Finnish halls, where there are Finnish halls, so you can kind of like scroll down the chat, so you can see answers to.
Well, so I'll give some quick answers that I know.
Yes.
Orin Tikkanen's Finnish folktales tapes are archived at the Finnish American Heritage Center. They're also archived at the Archives of Traditional Music at Indiana University. I don't believe either has been digitized, so they wouldn't be available unless they got digitized. Is there a difference between Finnish and Finnish American meanings of sisu? I haven't noticed any significant differences, I would say. I think that it seems to be a common idea that is still pretty strong. But I mean, the main thing is that individuals can kind of adjust sisu to how they feel, and that other people, like if you're saying you have sisu and you're doing something that clearly isn't displaying sisu, the group will tell you. There's Suomessa voidaan valmistaa vain marjaviineä. That means in Finland we can only make berry wine. So this is true. And again, sorry I'm such a good BSer. Sorry, I said that in a lecture. So yeah, I already talked about the kind of World Happiness Index and how it is that index is. Nature is very important for Finns, hardworking. Yeah, alcoholism is an interesting thing, right? That I think a lot of people consider a part of the Finnish American experience. I think one of the things that when people kind of mention populations that seem to have a propensity for that, one of the things that unites those people is that farming was introduced a lot later. So grain-based beverages were introduced a lot later, which I guess would have a biological intolerance, but I'm not really a geneticist or a biologist. So that's just me kind of talking out of what I've heard. Hi, Jennifer. So let's see, works for the University of Minnesota Extension, introduced community development initiatives in rural Minnesota. The towns with a high percentage of Finnish Americans have a high degree of citizen participation and success. Yes, that's true. I would agree with that.
Marjut is providing a recipe for the 9-grain bread. So it's on YouTube, evidently. So if you're interested, it's down there if you scroll. Marjut Kuklin for the 9-grain bread recipe.
And Amanda Irwin is asking the organization that had the St. Urho talk like a couple weeks ago, they're Finnish American cultural activities. And so if you just look them up on YouTube, you'll go straight to their channel, and they have all kinds of lecture videos. So, yeah.
Okay, well, I think we need to stop here, and thank you so much. We didn't get to all the questions, but some of these were definitely probably overlappingly addressed by Hillary in the answers. And
I'm just going to provide my email address if anybody,
that's what I was going to ask next. So you can get in touch with her directly, and also look for that link on the FinFest USA website. But now I want to wish you all a very good month between now and April, last Saturday in April, when we have the music program, and then it continues for the rest of this year. Thank you so much, Dr. Virtanen, and thank you for all the participants. Thank you for coming here, and we'll keep those Finnish American traditions going.
And Helena, before we go, thank you to everybody, and thank you to FinFest. And again, if you guys have questions, you can email me directly. Helena, will you take the chat and send it to me as a PDF? Because you can do that after this ends, the chat will pop up.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye everybody.
Hey.
Hey, heippa.